The first snow of the season came the morning the new housekeeper arrived at Harrowfield, and she came on foot up the long gray drive with a single trunk on a hired cart behind her and a gray wool cloak pulled close about, a face she had spent the better part of an hour arranging into a stranger's calm. She gave her name at the servants' door as Mrs. Ellen Vogum, a widow, 27 years old, lately of a household in Bath that had let its staff go. The under-butler wrote it in the book without looking at her, the pen scratching once and stopping. And he asked her only whether she had her character in writing, and she said she had, and produced it, a letter she had paid a Bath clerk to copy in a hand that would not be traced. The cook, a broad, kind woman named Mrs. Beddoe, with flour to the elbow, took her wet cloak and hung it by the range, and pressed a cup of tea into her cold hands before any question of references had been settled, because that was Mrs. Preece. Beddoe's way, and Ellen felt the warmth of the cup go into her fingers and had to look hard at the flagstones to keep her face in order. Nobody in that warm, low kitchen with its copper pans hung in a bright row and its smell of new bread and coal smoke and the particular damp of wet wool drying had any cause to look twice at a plain woman in a plain cloak. And so nobody did. A scullery maid glanced up and back down. A footman crossed through with a scuttle and did not slow. That was the whole of her plan, to be a shape that the eye slid off, to not be looked at. She had counted on the house being large enough that the master would never trouble himself over which woman kept his keys. She had counted on 7 winters being long enough to make a ghost of a face. She had not counted, that first afternoon, on the sound of his boots in the gallery above the kitchen stair, and the way her own hand went still on the ledger, and her heart set up a knocking in her throat, as though it meant to give her away before she had spoken to a single soul who might know her. You will meet a woman here who has decided to become no one, and a man who has spent 7 years mourning the very person she is pretending not to be. Stay with me. The pretending does not hold. Her name had once been Ellen Marsh, and before that it had been something else again, and the something else was the thing. She had walked 4 counties to bury. Harrowfield sat in a fold of Yorkshire hills, a great grey pile of a house with a chapel at its eastern end, and a churchyard beyond the chapel, and in that churchyard, under a stone that had been cut and set, with more care than tenderness usually allowed, there was a grave. The stone bore a name and 2 dates and the single word beloved. The name on the stone was Clara, Marchioness of Harrowfield. The second date was 7 winters gone, and the woman calling herself Mrs. Bora. Vasham had stood at the servants' door of the house that morning knowing, as no one else living knew, that the grave was empty. The master of the house was Julian Ashcombe, Marquess of Harrowfield, 34 years old, a tall man built broad through the shoulder, with dark hair kept unfashionably plain, and a jaw that had learned to hold itself against grief, until the holding had become his only expression. The county said he was cold. The county had been saying it for 7 years. He rode out alone at dawn. He dined alone. He kept the east wing shut and the chapel candles burning, and once a week, in all weathers, he walked to the churchyard and stood at the stone that said beloved and said nothing that anyone ever heard. He had not always been cold. Ellen remembered the man he had been before. Remembered it the way one remembers a country one has been exiled from. She had not come back to be remembered. She had come back because a letter had reached her in Bath, 3 weeks past, in a hand she did not know, saying only that the Marquess of Harrowfield was selling the Marsh cottage, and the 2 acres that went with it, the cottage where her mother still lived, and that the sale would put an old woman into the road before spring. Ellen had no money to stop a marquess. She had instead 2 hands and a memory of how a great house was run, and she had thought, in the cold arithmetic of the desperate, that if she could only get inside, if she could only be near enough to the ledgers and the man, she might find some honest way to spare her mother's roof. She had not let herself think past that. She had certainly not let herself think about the grave with her name on it. The dismissive word came to her on the 2nd day, and it came from the housekeeper she was replacing, a Mrs. Pell, who was leaving to nurse a sister in Leeds, and who had stayed a week to hand over the keys. "You will do well enough," Mrs. Pell said, sorting linens in the still room, "if you remember the one rule of this house. His lordship does not wish to be known. You are furniture to him, and you had best be good furniture. The last girl who tried to draw him into conversation was gone by Michaelmas. He wants a house that runs, and a face he need not remember. Be that, and you will keep your place. Nothing more than that. A pair of hands, and no history. A pair of hands and no history. Ellen turned the phrase over that night in the narrow room under the eaves, and found that it fit her like a glove she had asked to be measured for. No history. It was exactly what she had walked here to become. She was good at the work. That was the first thing that undid her plan, though she did not see it as a danger at the time. She had run a household before, a great one, and though her hands had gone soft with the years of small service in Bath, they remembered the shape of the labor as feet remember a stair climbed in the dark. Within a fortnight, the linens were mended, that had gone 6 months unmended. The still-room shelves were set to rights. The accounts that had drifted through a departing housekeeper's last careless quarter were squared to the penny. There had been a leak of small sums that no one had troubled to trace. A shilling here against candles never delivered, and Ellen traced it in an evening, and said nothing to anyone but quietly corrected the book, because a house that loses shillings will lose pounds. And because tracing it kept her hands busy in the long, cold evenings when her mind wanted to wander to a grave with her name on it. The maids who had grown slack under a mistress with 1 foot already in Leeds found themselves under a woman who noticed everything and raised her voice. Never. Who could set a girl right with a look and a low word, and who never once made a servant feel the smallness of her place. A scullery maid named Betsy, 13 and clumsy and frightened of being sent off, dropped a whole tray of the good china on the 3rd week, and Ellen knelt in the wreck of it beside the weeping child and said only, "It is china, Betsy, and you are a girl, and one of those can be replaced." And the girl would have walked into the sea for her after that. Ellen did it all, with her head lowered and her name kept small. Yet, a house that begins to run well is a house whose master notices the difference, even a master who has trained himself these 7 years to notice nothing. He noticed the fires first. The east wing, shut these 7 years, had grown a chill that crept along the whole of that side of the house, and Ellen, going through the rooms with the keys on her 2nd week, had found the old nursery and the small sitting room beyond it that had been, once, a private place. She had a fire laid in the sitting room grate, and the chimney swept, quietly, without asking. Because a cold house was an unhealthy house, and because her hands had done it without consulting her heart. She did not go into the room again after. The Marquess, however, passing the shut wing at dusk, saw a firelight where there had been dark for 7 years, and stopped, and stood a long moment in the corridor with his hand flat against the paneling, and said nothing to anyone, and did not have the fire put out. The near meeting came in the library, and it came at dawn, which was the 1 hour Ellen had thought herself safe. She had risen before the maids to see to the master's study fire, believing him gone out riding as he always was, and she had carried her scuttle through the library because the library was the shorter way, and she had stopped because he was there. He stood at the tall window, with his back to her, a dark shape against the gray light, and the snow was falling past the glass beyond him, and he had not gone riding at all. He turned at the small sound of the scuttle, and for the length of one breath, Ellen forgot every part of her plan, because his eyes came to her face and stayed there, and she saw something cross his features that was not the flat courtesy he gave the servants. It was closer to the look of a man who has heard, in a crowded room, a single note of music from a country he thought destroyed. "You are the new housekeeper," he said. His voice was low and level. Pah! It was a voice she had heard say her name, once in a garden in another life. "Yes, my lord." She kept her own voice flat, and her chin down, and her hands steady on the scuttle, by an act of will that cost her more than he could know. He looked at her a moment longer than the exchange required. Then he turned back to the window. "The east wing," he said. "You had a fire laid there." "The cold was spreading through the house, my lord. It was cheaper to warm the wing than to fight the chill everywhere. I did not think you would wish the expense of the damp." It was true, and it was also a lie, and both parts of it were steady. "Leave it laid," he said after a silence. "Go about your work." She went. Her heart did not slow until she reached the kitchen stair, and even then it did not slow so much as change its rhythm, and she stood a moment in the cold of the passage with her hand pressed to the wall, because she had looked into her husband's face for the first time in 7 winters, and he had not known her, and she did not know whether the thing she felt was relief or grief, and she suspected it was both, wearing each other's clothes. What she did not yet know was that he had gone back to the window and stood there long after she had gone, and had said, very quietly, to the falling snow, a name that was not Vogum. She had left him because she had believed it would save him. That was the shape of the wound she carried, and it is time you knew it, because the county's version was a lie, and even the Marquess had only half the truth. 7 winters gone. Clara Ashcombe had been 4 months a bride, and already a liability her husband's family meant to correct. She had come to Julian without fortune, a country gentleman's daughter, married for a reason, the old Marquess. Julian's father had never forgiven, and when the old Marquess lay dying that first winter, he had made it plain that the estate would be broken and the tenants ruined, and Julian himself cut off from every settled acre, unless the unfortunate marriage were undone. There were ways, the old man said. A marriage could be found wanting. A bride of no family could be made to disappear from the record, sent abroad quietly, the whole thing annulled and buried, and Julian freed to marry as the name required. And Clara, listening at a door she should not have listened at, had heard her husband refuse, had heard him say he would sooner see every acre sold than send his wife away, had understood, standing in that cold corridor with her hand at her mouth, that his love for her was going to cost him everything he had been raised to protect, and that he was too honorable to weigh the cost honestly, and that therefore the weighing would have to be done by her. She had run in the night, in the black hour before winter dawn, with a small bundle and her mother's maiden name, and a plan built in 3 sleepless nights. She had left a letter on his pillow that said less than the truth, that spoke of an unhappiness she did not feel, and a wish to be gone, that was the opposite of every wish she had, because the whole truth, written plain, would have brought him after her across every county in England and undone the entire purchase. And then, because a vanished marchioness is a scandal that follows a man for life, and a dead one is only a sorrow that time is supposed to soften, she had let a drowning be arranged with the help of the one old servant she trusted. A cloak left folded on a river bank below a fast, dark reach of water, a search that dragged the pools and found nothing, as such searches often found nothing. And at the end of it, a stone cut with 2 dates and the single word, beloved. She had stood far off in a hired coach on the far side of the county and watched no part of it, and had only heard weeks later that it was done, that she was buried, that the county pitied the young Marquess, his terrible loss. She had gone to Bath under her mother's maiden name and taken a place in a quiet household, and lived 7 years as a widow who had never in fact had a husband. And she had told herself, every one of those years, in the long evenings and the sleepless dawns, that she had bought him his estate and his freedom and his unbroken name with the only coin she had ever possessed, which was her own absence. She had not known, until the letter came about the cottage, that the freedom had bought him nothing, that he had married no one, that he had shut the east wing and kept the candles burning, and walked to a grave that held only earth, and had mourned her 7 winters, as though the drowning had been real. Ellen learned this slowly, in the way a housekeeper learns the truth of a house, from the maids and the cook and the shape of the master's grief laid out across the rooms she now kept. She learned that he had never courted another. She learned that the county's word for him, cold, was the word people use for a wound they are not permitted to see. She learned it, and it undid the whole justification she had lived inside for 7 years, because she had told herself she was setting him free. And here was the plain fact of the house telling her she had only buried him alongside the empty grave. The second time she heard the dismissive word, it was spoken in the great hall, and it was spoken by a lady, the Dowager Marchioness, Julian's Aunt Augusta had come to Harrowfield for the Christmas quarter as she came every year, to press upon her nephew the same argument his father had pressed, dressed now in the softer clothes of concern. Lady Augusta was 56, upright as a fire-iron, and she had brought with her a young woman named Miss Sophia Calvert, the daughter of an old friend, well-dowered, well-mannered, and entirely willing to be the next Marchioness of Harrowfield if the present one could only be persuaded to stay properly dead. 7 years, Julian, Lady Augusta said, on the first evening, in the great hall with the fire roaring, and Miss Calvert arranged prettily near the hearth. 7 years of candles and closed rooms. It is not grief any longer. It is a habit, and habits can be broken. You will receive Miss Calvert kindly while she is here, and you will consider what I have said. And then, because Ellen had come in with the tea and was crossing the hall with the tray, Lady Augusta's eye fell on her, and moved past her as one's eye moves past a chair. And do something about the servants, the dowager said, not lowering her voice, because there was no one present whose hearing she counted. That housekeeper of yours has a face like a closed shutter. One likes a little warmth from the staff at Christmas. She is a cold, plain sort of woman. Where did you find her? She keeps the house well, Julian said. That is all one asks of such people, said Lady Augusta, and turned back to Miss Calvert. Ellen set down the tray with hands that did not shake, poured the tea, and withdrew. And if the Marquess's eyes followed the closed-shutter face of his housekeeper across the hall a fraction longer than the dowager's careless verdict could account for, only the fireside. The days after that ran thin and cold, and full of a particular tension that Ellen could feel gathering in the house like weather before snow. Miss Calvert was everywhere she was meant to be, at the breakfast table, in the morning room, in the drawing room over the tea things, walking the long gallery on the Marquess's arm at the hours the dowager arranged, pausing before the portraits of Ashcombs long dead, while Lady Augusta named their marriages and their fortunes, in a voice pitched for her nephew to overhear. She was not unkind, Miss Calvert. That was the difficulty of her. She was 22, and pretty in the way. A well-kept garden is pretty, and she had been raised from the cradle to be exactly what the dowager wanted her to be. And she went through the paces of the courtship with a patience that suggested she found her own part in it as tiresome as anyone. Ellen watched it all from the edges of rooms, as a housekeeper watches, present and unseen, replenishing a fire, removing a tray, and she understood the Marquess's courtesy for what it was the moment she saw him hand Miss Calvert into a chair, the courtesy of a man enduring a thing rather than choosing it. Exact as a form of words in a language, he had grown up speaking and no longer meant. He did not warm to Miss Calvert. When the girl spoke, he answered, and when she was silent, he was glad of the silence. And once Ellen saw him look up over the tea things and out through the tall window at the churchyard end of the house, with an expression that made her set down the pot and leave the room. He did not refuse the girl either. For all that, he let the days go on and the dinner be planned, because refusing meant a conversation with his aunt that would open the sealed east wing of himself, and he had not opened it in 7 years. Ellen, who had once staked a whole life on the belief that his honor would eventually make him do the sensible thing and put her aside, felt a fear she had no right in the world to feel, take root and grow in her chest, watching a dowered girl in the house she had given up, and she despised the fear even as it kept her awake. She had come to save a cottage. She had not come to stand in a corridor at Christmas and watch her husband be courted by a dowered girl in ice-blue silk. She had given him up. She had cut the word beloved into stone with her own choice. She had no claim on the tightness in her throat when Miss Calvert laughed at his elbow, and she knew it, and the knowing did not help. The command came on the coldest night of December, and it was the first crack in the plan she could not mend afterward. She had been in the still room past midnight, going over the quarter's accounts by a single candle because the dowager's household had swelled the expenses, and Ellen meant to find the shillings honestly before she was asked for them. She had not heard him come down. She looked up and he was in the doorway in his shirt-sleeves, a candle in his hand, and the sight of him there, unguarded with the careful daytime distance stripped off him, went through her like cold water. "It is past midnight," he said. "You have been at the books since supper." "There is a great deal to reconcile, my lord, with her ladyship's household added." He came into the small, warm room. He set his candle on the shelf. He looked at the columns of her figures, at the neat spare hand that had squared his drifting accounts, and something moved in his face that she could not read in the low light. "Stop working," he said. "Eat something. You have grown thin since you came, and I will not have my house run by a woman who forgets to feed herself. Sit down." It was a command. It was, in its bones, the exact kind of command he had once given her across a breakfast table in the first weeks of a marriage, when he had learned that she forgot to eat when she was anxious, and had made it his business to see that she did not. He could not have known he was giving it. Her body knew, though. Her body had heard that particular protection in that particular voice before, and it answered before her mind could stop it, and she sat and something in her face came loose for half a second before she caught it. He saw it. She knew he saw it, because he went very still, the way a man goes still when a shape in the dark resolves for an instant into something known, and then blurs again. He did not speak. He brought her bread and cold meat from the cook's larder with his own hands, a marquess fetching supper for a housekeeper at 1 in the morning, and he stood while she ate as though he did not trust her to do it unwatched. And the whole of it was so tender, and so wrong, and so exactly the shape of a thing she had thrown away, that Ellen ate with her eyes down and her jaw tight to keep from weeping. "You remind me of someone," he said at last, low almost to himself. "I cannot think who." "I have one of those faces, my lord," Ellen said. "Common enough." "No," he said. "You do not." And he took his candle and went, and left her in the still room with her hand pressed flat to the table, and 7 years coming apart at the seams. You have watched two people stand a foot apart, one of them knowing everything, and one of them knowing almost nothing, and you have wanted to speak into that gap yourself. Hold on a little longer. The gap does not stay a gap. After that night the house held its breath, or Ellen did, which came to the same thing. She kept further from him. She sent the maids where she had gone herself. She did the accounts by day, in company, and still the thing built, because a house cannot hold two people who once made a whole life together, and keep them strangers by an effort of will, and the dowager, sensing something she could not name, pressed harder toward the match, and set a date in the new year for a dinner, at which the county would be shown that the Marquess of Harrowfield had at last put off his mourning. The undoing came from the smallest corner of the house, as such things do. There was a child at Harrowfield, a boy of 6 named Thomas, the son of the steward, who had lost his mother the previous spring to a fever, and who had taken in the way of grieving children to the one room in the house where a fire now burned that had not burned in years. The servants indulged him in it because his grief was fresh, and because the east wing was empty, and no harm could come of a small boy sitting in a warm room. He had found his way there by the same firelight that had stopped his master in the corridor, and he sat in the window seat with his dead mother's shawl about his thin shoulders, and watched the snow, and asked no one for anything. Ellen found him there on a gray afternoon a week before the dowager's dinner, curled small in the window seat, with the shawl pulled to his chin, his eyes fixed on the falling snow, with the particular stillness of a child who has learned that if he is quiet enough, the world will forget to move him along. She did not send him back to the kitchens. She had a basket of mending on her arm, and she set it down and sat beside him on the window seat. And after a while, because the silence wanted filling, and because his small cold hand had crept without his knowing it, against the warmth of her sleeve, she began to talk. She told him a story her own mother had told her, in the cottage on the marshland, a story about a girl who walked over the winter hills to reach a light she could see far off, and did not once believe herself lost, though the snow came down and the dark came down with it. She told it low and slow, the way she had once meant, in this very room, to tell stories to children of her own who would never come. And while she told it, she took the torn edge of the boy's mother's shawl into her lap and mended it with the needle from her basket, small, even stitches. because a thing a grieving child holds to. She did not know that the Marquess had come to the wing again, because he had seen the firelight from the drive, and could not, any more than the child could, stay away from the one warm room on the cold side of his house. He stood at the doorway, and he watched his housekeeper hold a grieving child, and mend a dead woman's shawl, and tell a story, in a low voice about a girl who walked over the hills in winter and was not lost, and he did not announce himself, and Ellen did not know he was there until the story was done and the boy asleep against her shoulder. She looked up, and this time there was no candle to hide behind, and no scuttle to carry, and no crowded hall. Only the two of them, and a sleeping child, and the snow at the glass, and the Marquess of Harrowfield looked at the face of his housekeeper for a long, long moment, and Ellen watched the thing she had feared and longed for in equal measure move across his features, watched him see, and she did not look away because she was tired at last of being no one. He did not say her name. He was not certain enough, or he was too certain and too afraid. He said, "Who taught you that story?" "My mother," Ellen said. "In a cottage on the marshland your lordship means to sell." She had not meant to say it. It came out of her before her caution could catch it. All of it. There in the one sentence, the marshland, the mother, the truth, walking out into the room on its own feet. And she watched him hear it. Watched him set the name Marsh beside the face he could not place. Watched 7 years of certainty about a grave begin to move in him like ice going out of a river in spring. "The sale is stopped," he said, which was not an answer to anything she had asked, and was the only answer that mattered. "It has been stopped since the day I read your mother's name in the ledger, and could not make my hand sign it." And then he turned and left the room, because a Marquess does not weep in front of a child, and Ellen sat with the sleeping boy and the mended shawl, and understood that the thing was known now, or nearly, and that there was no plan left to keep. He came to her that night in the still room where it had started. And he came, knowing. Clara. He said it from the doorway. He had never in 7 years said it aloud to a living person, and it came out of him rough, like a hinge that is rusted shut. "You are alive. You have been alive. You have been under my roof carrying my keys for 2 months, and you let me call you Mrs. Vaughan." Ellen stood. There was no cloak now, no lowered chin, no closed shutter. "I let you," she said, "because I did not come back to be your wife. I came back to save my mother's roof, and I meant to do it, and go, and never let you carry the knowing of me on top of the grieving. I thought the grief would heal. I did not know until I came that you had let it wall you up alive." "You drowned," he said. "There was a stone. I cut the word into it myself." "I know what you cut," Ellen said, and her voice broke on it at last. "I heard your father, Julian, that last winter. I heard him tell you to send me abroad and undo the marriage and save the estate. And I heard you refuse, and I knew you would go on refusing until it ruined you, and I could not be the thing that ruined you. So I made myself into a sorrow instead of a scandal, because a sorrow costs a man less. I thought I was setting you free." "Free," he said the word as though it were foreign to him. He crossed the small room. He stopped a foot from her, close as they had not been in 7 winters, and she felt the old pull of him in every part of her that had spent 7 years pretending it was dead. "I have been free, Clara, of everything but the one thing I wanted. I let my father's estate stay whole, and I have hated every acre of it. Do you know what I have wanted, these 7 years? Not the name, not the land. You. At the breakfast table forgetting to eat. That is the whole of what I have wanted, and I buried it under a stone." His hand came up. It stopped short of her face, hovering, the way a man's hand stops at a thing he is not sure he is permitted to touch. And Ellen felt the warmth of it a breath from her cheek, and did not move away. "I am asking," he said, low, level, the voice stripped now of all its careful distance. "Not commanding. I have commanded you across this house for 2 months, and I am done with it. I am asking you to stay. To be my wife again in the daylight where the county can see it. I do not care what it costs." "It will cost you a great deal," Ellen whispered. "Your aunt has a dinner planned. A dowered girl in ice-blue silk. A county waiting to be told you have put off your mourning at last. Then the county will be told something else, said the Marquess of Harrowfield, and for the first time in 7 winters, standing a foot from the wife he had buried, something almost like a smile touched the corner of his hard mouth. Stay. She stayed. His hand crossed the last inch and touched her face, and she turned her cheek into his palm, and neither of them said anything at all for a long moment, because there are recognitions that need no further words, only the fact of a warm hand and a face that leans to meet it. The dowager's dinner went forward exactly as Lady Augusta had planned it, save in the one particular that mattered. The great hall of Harrowfield was lit that night with every candle it possessed, the long table laid for 30, the county's first families arranged along it in silk and diamonds, and at the head of it the Marquess, and near him, placed there by his aunt's careful hand, Miss Sophia Calvert, in ice-blue silk, with her mother's pearls at her throat. Lady Augusta sat in state at her nephew's right, and surveyed the room she had arranged with the confidence of a woman whose plans had worked everywhere she had ever laid them. Ellen was not at the table. Ellen was where a housekeeper belonged, at the edge of the hall, seeing to the service, in her plain gray gown with the keys at her waist. And the third voicing of the word came from Lady Augusta as the second course was laid, spoken down the table to Miss Calvert's mother in the carrying voice of a woman who did not count the servants as present. "One does what one can with the material to hand," the dowager said, watching Ellen direct a footman. "That housekeeper, for instance, a cold, plain creature with no history to her at all. But she keeps a good table, and one asks nothing more of that sort. History is for the people who sit at the table, is it not? Not the ones who lay it." A few of the guests smiled. Miss Calvert did not. She had begun, over the past days, to sense that the ground she stood on was not as solid as her mother believed, and she had the grace to look uncomfortable. And the Marquess of Harrowfield set down his glass. He rose. The hall, which had been loud with 30 conversations, began to quiet, the way a room quiets when the man at the head of the table stands without warning. Lady Augusta looked up at her nephew with the pleased expression of a woman who believes the announcement she has engineered is about to be made. Julian did not look at Miss Calvert. He looked down the length of the bright hall to the plain gray figure at its edge. And he crossed to her, past the pearls and the diamonds and the 30 turning faces, and the room went entirely silent as he walked, because there was in his walk a purpose that stopped. He stopped before his housekeeper. He held out his hand to her in front of the whole county, and into the silence, in a voice level and clear and made to carry to every ear in the hall, he said the thing that ended the hierarchy's hold on her in the arena where it had ruled. "This is my wife. She was never dead." The hall did not breathe. Lady Augusta's hand went to the edge of the table and gripped it. Miss Calvert closed her eyes for a moment, and, to her lasting credit, let out a small breath that was almost relief. War. And Ellen, in her plain gray gown, put her hand into the hand of the Marquess of Harrowfield, and the keys at her waist caught the candlelight, and she stepped out of the edge of the hall and into the center of it, into the light, where the county could see her. "Julian," the dowager began, low and fast, "this is impossible. The woman is a servant. There was a grave. You cannot possibly—" "There was an empty grave, aunt," the Marquess said, "over which I wasted 7 years you encouraged me to waste. This is Clara Ashcombe, Marchioness of Harrowfield, my wife by a marriage my father wished undone, and I never once regretted. She left to spare me a ruin I would gladly have suffered. She has come home. You will receive her, or you will not return to this house." He said it without heat, which was worse than heat, and Lady Augusta, who had spent a life reading rooms, read this one, and understood that the script that had worked in every drawing room in the county had failed at last in this hall, and that the failure was public and complete. She did not fragment loudly. She was too well-bred for that. She simply sat, and her hand came off the table, and she looked at the plain woman standing in the candlelight with the Marquess's hand around hers, and she said after a long moment, in a voice gone thin, "You have his eyes described in you. I did not see it. I did not look. Which was as near to an apology as Lady Augusta had ever come in her life. And Ellen, who had every reason to want the woman's humbling, found she wanted only to have it over. The county did what a county does. By morning the whole of Yorkshire knew that the Marchioness of Harrowfield had returned from the dead, and the versions multiplied, and Ellen let them, because the truth was hers and Julian's, and did not require the county's belief to be true. They were married again in the small chapel at the eastern end of the house quietly, on a morning in the new year, with the snow deep on the churchyard beyond the chapel wall, and the stone that said beloved still standing over its empty earth. Julian had asked her whether she wished the stone taken up. Ellen had said to leave it. It had told the truth. She said in its way. Something had been buried there. It had simply not been her body. The vicar read the words. The steward stood witness, and his son Thomas held the ring on a cushion, with the enormous gravity of a child given an important task, wrapped in his mother's mended shawl. There was no county at the ceremony, and no ice blue silk, and no dowered girl. There was a fire in the East Wing sitting-room afterward, in the room where a grieving boy had fallen asleep against her shoulder, and there Ellen sat with her husband on a settle drawn close to the hearth, while the snow came down past the tall windows. And the house that had been shut and cold on one whole side of itself was warm all the way through, for the first time in 7 winters. He had brought something down from the study. He put it into her hands without a word. It was a miniature, a small painted oval in a worn gold case, and it was her own face painted the first spring of their marriage, that he had carried in his breast pocket every day for 7 years, the case worn smooth at the edges by a thumb that had passed over it 10,000 times. She had wondered that first day in the library why his hand had gone to his coat when he looked at her. Now she knew. He had been reaching, without knowing it, for the painted ghost of the living woman standing in front of him. I could not put it away, he said. In 7 years I could not put it in a drawer. Now I do not have to. Ellen closed the worn gold case in her hand and looked at the fire and the snow and the man beside her, and she thought of the long gray drive she had walked up in the first snow of the season, a woman who had decided to become no one, and she thought of the plan she had carried in like a trunk on a hired cart. To save a cottage and slip away and let the grief heal on its own. The grief had not healed on its own. Nothing heals in a walled-up room. It heals in the daylight, witnessed, named, with a fire lit on the cold side of the house, and a hand that crosses the last inch to touch a face it has mourned. Outside in the churchyard, the snow filled in the letters of the word beloved, a little at a time, softening it the way snow softens everything it is patient enough to cover. Inside, the fire cracked and settled. Thomas had fallen asleep again on the hearthrug with the mended shawl around him, and no one moved to wake him. And Ellen Ashcombe, who had once cut her own name into stone to buy a freedom no one had wanted, sat in the warm heart of the house she had crept into as a stranger, and let herself at long last be known. If Clara and Julian's long way home moved you, stay a moment and tell me which winter you would have walked back through the snow for. Thank you for staying to the end.